Hi, Lawrence LeBrocq, Managing Partner and CEO of Garces, Grabler, and LeBrocq. Welcome to our podcast. Today's show is about inclusion. It's people that are being trained to become comfortable with the disabled. Our podcast is Triumph Over Tragedy. And with us today is Brittany Déjean. Welcome to the show, Brittany.
Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us all a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with training people at corporations on how to become comfortable with disabled individuals.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Inclusion Jumpstart is relatively new, just started a few months ago. But really this started for me when I was a kid. My dad was paralyzed in a car accident when I was 12 and really quickly saw how the world treated him differently. When that started, it would be anything from going to our mall and now being stared at. Or I remember once as a kid, I guess I was a young teenager, but we were out to dinner and the waiter asked me what my dad wanted to eat. And I was really confused until I noticed how uncomfortable the waiter was to actually speak to my dad directly. And those things stuck with me. But then fast forward a little bit, and actually I recognized that I had that reaction to someone with a different disability than my dad. And I knew enough to say, this is how other people treat my dad, but I'm doing this to her. This isn't right. Like, I need to fix this, but I didn't know how. And thankfully, the family, I was able to be honest about my discomfort, and I was treated with empathy. And now we're talking, I was in college, so this is very, very early. And by the time I started being in my career post-college, I had begun working on a nonprofit organization for disability, specifically more so tied to spinal cord injury, helping families connect to resources, very in line with what my family experienced. But as I kind of went out in the world, I found I'm talking about my website, trying to help people understand why people who have a life-changing injury need resources to help them adapt their lives. But people would come to me and say, well, I had a boss in a wheelchair once and I didn't know what to do, so I avoided him. No. And I'd say, okay, so we have to pivot this conversation, because this is then the daughter of a quadriplegic comes out to say, you don't have to feel this way. And I'm not going to make you feel like a terrible person. I know what this feels like, but I'm not going to let you leave this conversation continuing to feel that way. And this happened over and over and over again. Conferences, weddings, like really wherever I would talk about the work I was doing, I would be fielding these kinds of questions that people were afraid to ask, or awkward interactions they'd want clarity on. And I started to see themes. And I started to understand what people had to believe to be true about disability for them to say the things that they were saying that were often grounded in these misconceptions. And so I turned it into a training, kind of just, this is me on my own. I'm still running a nonprofit. Eventually made my way into Airbnb, where a disabled friend of mine had, his company had been acquired, and he knew what I was doing, and he said, hey, can you help me? He himself, power wheelchair, low physical mobility. So again, very apparent disability, and he could tell people weren't sure really what to do with him, and they didn't know much about the topic area. So it was an incredible opportunity for me to go in and trial this at a larger scale, because really what had become apparent to me is how deeply rooted this discomfort is. And
so what are some of the common misconceptions or perceptions that people have about somebody who's disabled?
I usually anchor on three that I think tend to dominate. One being that people with disabilities are incapable, or only specifically capable of certain things. Right. Another one being that people with disabilities are miserable, or at a minimum have a worse quality of life than someone who is not disabled. And the third one tends to be that people with disabilities are inspirations for existing. So meaning they're not necessarily looked at for the quality of an accomplishment, but for the fact that they're actually living a life with their disability at all.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. You said your dad was paralyzed, quadriplegic from an accident. How old were you at this time?
12.
Tell us a little about the effect that had. What was life like before the accident, and how does it change in just a split second?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was in middle school. I was in 7th grade. So I think before, trying to figure out middle school, my parents were divorced. So my younger brother and I switched houses. I played sports. I did well in school. And, kind of had a rhythm, right, of this is just the way life goes. So the accident, when it happened, it was my dad and my brother in the car, and my brother was killed in the accident instantly. And so that, plus my dad's injury, that kicked off 6 months of my dad being hospitalized for the rest of my 7th grade year.
Right.
It happened just a few days before Christmas, so there was a bit of a gap from school anyway. So I kind of had time, but once school picked up again, I went back. And I think there's just the shift in that was I no longer was moving house to house with someone else. Well, I wasn't shifting houses at the time with my dad being hospitalized, but to get back into a rhythm, it was irrevocably changed. And, I had to go back into places as almost a new person. I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania, and so, everybody knew everybody. Friends in my grade had siblings in my brother's grade. It was on the front page of our local paper,
Right.
So it became an identity in itself to be that Brittany, that person,
Sure.
as much as it also became an identity shift in my understanding of medical systems, and just understanding what my dad was going through physically, and we were all very involved. My mom, my stepmom, myself, extended family, we were very united team with my dad figuring out those first few months. So it was definitely putting one foot in front of the other, I think. And I was young, really.
Sure.
So it's a lot of hindsight to look back on those
Right.
times now than what I was probably wasn't looking at the bigger picture when I was younger.
So Dad probably got out of the hospital. You were probably about 13.
Yep.
And you talked about an incident where you were at a restaurant, and it was kind of like the light bulb went off type of incident when that person, the waiter, asked you what your dad wanted. Here you have a grown man unfortunately, probably in a wheelchair.
Right.
But no cognitive deficit, and he could order for himself, but yet they asked you just because he was in a wheelchair. And how old were you at that time?
Probably, 13, 14. It wasn't immediately after he
Yep.
came home, because I think it took us a little time to
Sure.
get back to rhythms of going out and things like that, and for my dad to learn to drive. But I do remember that happening, and again, that it took me a minute to say, they're super awkward.
Yeah.
It wasn't an anger. It was just well, what does he want? And that stuck with me.
Right. And then you go through high school, college. How did you decide to start this business? What was it that you said, okay, I want to start to jumpstart Inclusion Jumpstart?
Well, this only happened months ago at this point. So,
Right.
but really, this awkwardness and having this conversation is a through line through nearly 20 years of my life. Well, professionally, and then even before that when I was younger. So once I was running my website, and that was an incredible experience, working with families and trying to help families who had been in our situation, because we ended up at an amazing rehabilitation center in Philadelphia. My dad had a lot of support, so he was able to adapt his life,
Sure.
Go back to work, drive his car. We were able to rebuild. And it was during college that I realized that most didn't have that. And so that was the first light switch of people aren't seeing this the same way. And it was when I started having those conversations, talking about my website that would pivot into people's awkwardness and discomfort, that I realized, wow, people do not see disability the same way. And honestly, one of the comments that I would get more than once would be that I'd rather be dead than live like that. And
Right.
it would sometimes be in direct reference to my dad that I would have just described in the context of my nonprofit. So, and that's where, for me, I think this, again, a lot of hindsight here, but I think the nail that kind of stuck in me was, you can't say that, because I saw death and disability next to each other. My brother died and my dad survived. Now, my dad survived sitting down for the rest of his life, but here we are 26 plus years later, and I still hang out with my dad. So there's there's loss in devastating injury like that. I'm not saying that there's not grief, there's not tragedy, it's difficult. But there is life, there is hope, there is adaptation, there is resilience, and an opportunity to go forward. And when it came to my brother, there was a finality. Now there's different impacts and things you can take from loss in that sense. But I think when I was hearing people think that death was better than disability, for someone who went through that night at 12, learning what had happened, it's like, no, I don't think you.
No, I don't
you
think
get
so
it.
either.
You know,
I've heard young people say the same thing. But if you have, I'm sure your dad would look them in the eye and say, "Are you out of your mind? I get to spend 26 years with my daughter." Like, there's so many more things that are important than being able to walk. And if it comes down to life, nobody wants to be paralyzed, but I don't think anybody's choosing death that has a family and loved ones. Maybe people say that when they're 17, 18, they don't realize the depth of life, but it's once you have a life, you realize how precious it is.
And that's why I think there's been a through line for me that's to say there's a lot that has to get better about how disability is regarded, because a lot of these assumptions that I know people make feed these kinds of beliefs.
Sure.
And then those are the kinds of people who go into either acquire a disability or their loved one gets a disability or they have a child with a disability, and that can really color their experience in a way where they're not coming into it with the mentality of, like, the way that we've framed disability for generations is so negative, and it's based on what's wrong with you, it's based on fixing, it is not representative of so many people who live incredibly fulfilling, diverse lives with disability. And there is also still a lot that needs to get better in terms of accessibility, inclusion, people having the resources and care that they need to be able to live those lives. It's not perfect, but the way that I felt that I could have an impact was to stand in the middle and say, hey, I can help you see this differently so that we can start to put those pieces together and that you're ready to engage with people with disabilities, work with people with disabilities, hire them, and just work towards that more equitable society.
I think people, and tell me if I'm wrong, please, that they're afraid that the people aren't going to work as hard. They're going to have to make too many accommodations for the people to be able to be successful. Do you run into that?
I have in like a hiring, this is a very personal problem, but then it manifests into business.
Yep.
And so this is how, in my years at Airbnb, my years running organizations, talking to people, I understand that this is a personal discomfort that manifests as serious barriers to inclusion, and I don't think we talk about the human side of it enough. Because that assumption, like, oh, they won't work that hard, or, oh, they'll be too expensive, is all rooted in that original assumption of inability.
Yes.
And quality of life, like, oh, they're unhappy, or, oh, they're incapable, therefore they're not going to work that hard. So you really have to work with people to catch them before they're making that downstream assumption that is going to result in exclusion and risk for their company. But it kind of comes with any sort of diversity or inclusion effort sometimes, where there's people who can make assumptions based on identity to say, well, women don't work as hard, or X identity doesn't work as hard, or we have to lower the bar if we're going to hire a woman. I've heard these things. There's been a lot of progress, but people know these kinds of assumptions exist and have existed. And so it doesn't make them correct. And the ones with disability, I feel sometimes because we haven't had this conversation enough, and because so many people are uncomfortable or unwilling or don't know how to listen to people with disabilities and the disabled advocates who can solve all these problems, that they seem a little bit more stuck and they feel not as addressed compared to other conversations about other identities.
Yeah, I would love to introduce these people to Eric LeGrand.
I know Eric.
Eric is,
Yeah.
we're partners with Eric, and we
I love
support
that.
his Walk to Believe. So if you know anybody interested, that's on September 6th, his Walk
fun.
to Believe at Rutgers.
He came and did an Airbnb event a couple of years back.
He's a fantastic human being. So anyone who thinks that people are unhappy or miserable because they're a quadriplegic need to meet Eric LeGrand. He is such a driven young man. He has his own line of bourbon. He has a his own line of coffee, a
I saw
coffee
that.
shop. He's the color commentator at Rutgers Athletics, and he speaks nationally as a motivational speaker. The kid always has, I call him a kid, he's in his 30s, but to me he's still a kid, always has a smile on his face no matter when I see him. And you know, you treat him like a human being. Like, I bust his chops about how great his coffee is. I go, that's so crazy about your bourbon. But I tease him, and he's just another guy. And that's what people have to understand. They have to be comfortable enough to realize that's just another human being.
And it's not rocket science, but I think if you don't meet people with the discomfort with empathy to understand it's okay that maybe you tense up or that you're awkward or you're afraid of what you're going to say when person has X, Y, or Z disability or has disclosed a disability in front of you. But there's a way through that. And that's because you don't want to leave people in that state. And when people get afraid of the mistakes, and they get afraid that if they make one or maybe someone reacted poorly to a previous mistake, like they're done forever because they're a terrible human being. And there's so much exaggerated assumptions that get made. And when you see someone like Eric, and I've met Eric and plenty of wonderful people with disabilities all over, it is just, once I met a guy in a wheelchair who was at a conference, some random unrelated to disability conference, and I went into the elevator with him and we were going somewhere, and I just talked to him and we started chatting and eventually got to like, what do you do? And I told him about, at the time I was working on my nonprofit, and he was like, oh, I could tell you had some kind of connection. And I said, huh, why? And he said, because you looked me in the eyes.
Jeez.
And that stuck with me too, because I said, for me, that was natural. I wasn't doing anything on purpose, but it made me realize that in a regular kind of corporate conference, this is not a disability related event, that would be considered not every interaction for him. And so I think it is seeing that people like Eric exist and others exist who are just out there living their lives. They for sure have hardships.
Sure.
Right? As everyone does. And some may be different. You know, it's not a game of who has it worse than who, but our humanity remains no matter what. And it's about seeing each other's humanity to be able to respect that, you know, if you went out to dinner with Eric and ended up at a restaurant that was inaccessible, that sucks.
Right.
And maybe it's not a problem you would face had you gone to dinner on your own, but it doesn't make Eric lesser. That's not his problem. That's the restaurant's problem.
It is.
Right? So that's how we can kind of shift it to say we can meet people where they are, we can see people for who they are, and build more inclusive societies by creating space for more lived experiences.
So tell us, I know this is a new business, but you don't need to disclose the names, but are you going to various corporations? Where are you speaking? What type of events?
So I'm lining things up like that now. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and so I have an engagement lined up for that month. For example, people are starting to book that now. Speaking engagements, one's like an online panel discussion for employers who are interested in being more inclusive.
Right.
One is a corporation that has a new ERG for their disabled employees who want to, actually it's funny, it's the disabled employees who reached out to me because they want their company to do better.
Okay.
And they want that baseline conversation so that they can be listened to better.
Sure.
So that's what I'm starting with right now, and otherwise have been coming on podcasts and writing and doing things to start to bring light to this conversation, because I feel that we need more empathy in the conversation and space for people to feel imperfect and honor that the story of disability told up to this point is in drastic need of an overhaul.
Yes. No, as an attorney, and I used to go to the courthouse almost every day, and there was always a blind attorney, and he did very well. And I always thought to myself, man, it's got to be tough for him because he can't read, the books like we do. He has to get them made in Braille. He's got everything to be done a different way. Or, now you have computers that can talk to you. But at the time, there wasn't such a thing. And for me, it's a matter of, man, look what this person's overcoming. But he's still a human being. I want to kick his butt if I'm trying a case against him. I don't give a crap that you're blind. I'm going to.
You want to win your
I
case.
want to win my case. Nothing personal. And just like if you could see fine. But you have to look at these people as people. And that's shocking to me when you said that the gentleman in the wheelchair said, I knew you had a connection because you looked me in the eye. Where the hell else do you look at somebody when you talk to them? I mean, I'm from a generation, obviously you can't shake hands with somebody who's a paraplegic. You meet somebody, you look them in the eye and you shake their hand.
Yeah.
So, you look them in the eye and say hello.
I mean, but you can shake my dad's hand, and I've seen also people that can still, because his fingers don't move.
Right.
So he won't squeeze back, but he'll give you his hand. And I've seen that happen too. It's the discomfort because people can be afraid of shaking their hand wrong.
Yeah.
Right? So again, I think why I love doing this and why I love working with people and having this conversation is because I have yet to meet someone who doesn't have the best of intentions. Everyone wants to be better at this. Everyone does not want to offend anyone.
Sure.
There is really pure intentions, but good intentions are not an excuse for exclusion, are not an excuse for avoidance, and are not an excuse for inaction. And so by being able to help people understand, to make the mental shift, to shift their mental model of disability so that they're not gripped by that fear of messing up, and understand that they can actually live out their good intentions. And if they make a mistake, they're not terrible, right? There is this kind of misconception that there is some manual somewhere that you can read from start to finish and you're going to be this perfect.
Well, you're right at that, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, right. I'll get back to you on that. But I feel like people think that book exists, feel terrible they haven't read it yet, and then clam up, or they've been given like an etiquette list at some point and they're trying to follow it. But best practices are great, but they're not ironclad. And if you are trying to get an A on the test rather than honoring the humanity of the person in front of you, then if a blind person, for example, does something different than what you think the etiquette said or prefers something different, then you're going to think, well, why do I even try, right? As opposed to saying, the baseline of human interaction and our norms for social interaction and respect apply. And then when someone tells you they prefer or need something, you're equipped to listen to them, hear them, and honor that rather than do what you think they need or what you think that book would have said or should have said.
Right. What amazes me is how people underestimate people with a disability. Instead of realizing, and I'll use Eric LeGrand because I know Eric, and it takes him 2.5 hours just to get ready in the morning. Yeah. There's a guy with some really great work ethic because he's going to go through that every day. And He starts his day at 11 o'clock. And that guy works until midnight and goes to sleep and does this all over again. So you have to look at the individual. It's really the quality, the character of that individual that will prevail as opposed to what their disability or limitations are physically. So I don't understand sometimes the attitude. I can understand maybe being a little uncomfortable for people in the beginning, but once you get to know a person, you're a little uncomfortable with anybody, but once you get to know a person, it should go away.
And I think in Eric's case, it's also the fact that, his degree of paralysis requires an amazing support team and care team, and not everybody has access to that. And so I think sometimes those realities of the people who can't access those things will pepper people's opinions of what is possible with a life like that. And so I don't want to avoid the reality that many people with disabilities don't have what they need to live the lives they would. But when you see what someone can achieve when they have what they need, then you get the Erics and then tons of other people who do their version of what they want their life to look like. And I think, to your point, there is that discomfort. When you meet a new person, you meet a new person, right? But when I think someone does have a personal relationship with someone with a disability, whether that be in a colleague or some other way, not a family member, but say you have some kind of experience, it can completely change how you see disability beyond that one person you know. But I think we can make these changes faster than waiting for everybody to get to know someone with a disability. Because I think when I would say very similar things probably happened in my dad's office. He went back to the same company he was with before his accident. And so, I'm sure many people in his office didn't really know what to do or didn't know how to interact with him as a quadriplegic, maybe had questions. There was probably adaptation. But it would have changed the next time then they go out and see someone in a wheelchair. They're likely going to have a different perspective because they knew my dad. Right. And I'm sure it sounds like Eric has affected you also. And so that's amazing when that happens, and it does happen all the time. I just think that when it gets into business and actually, making sure that it's not actually harming your business behind the scenes, there's, again, these downstream assumptions that create problems, and you're missing out on a lot of the benefits that can happen because of that discomfort, rather than waiting for that one person to come through and change your mind. If we can start having the conversations, normalize, the misconceptions so that they can be changed, then it's a faster track to changing the general perception and shifting our perspective, the societal perception from, there's some who do okay, to like default benefit of the doubt. Let's see what they can do. Let's, meet them for who they are. Let them be a person who's got a life that is different than mine and as anybody else I meet.
Right. So tell us, how are you helping the situation?
I am having conversations with as many people as I can, or speaking or, interacting with people however I can, meeting them with empathy so that they feel equipped and comfortable and ready to act on their good intentions and be more inclusive and interact and work directly with people with disabilities.
Well, if there's HR directors or owners of companies that want to meet with you to talk to their management team or their team members, how do they contact you?
I'm on LinkedIn a lot, so that's the best way to reach me, or inclusionjumpstart.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you want to add or tell the audience about Inclusion Jumpstart, or anything else about the paraplegic, the disabled community, and how we can better assist them in becoming members of our teams?
Yeah. I think the stories we've been told about disability for a long time have gone unchallenged in many ways, and so I don't blame, and many don't blame anyone for falling into some of the misconceptions that exist. But if you listen to this and now you know there are things to fix, then again, it's not an excuse for inaction, and that it is important to face, I call it FOMO, your fear of messing up. You got to look it in the face. You got to be willing to maybe unlearn things that you think are true or maybe you didn't know to challenge, so that you can act on your good intentions and be the leader you want to be and build the strongest, best business you can. And that's going to come from bringing in all kinds of different people with all kinds of different skill sets and backgrounds.
Brittany Déjean, Inclusion Jumpstart. Contact her. Thank you.